So this video aims to go over the arterial blood supply of the upper limb, specifically the arm, the forearm, as well as the head and neck. So I've drawn out a rough outline of the major blood vessels stemming from the coronary circulation, so stemming from the heart. So as you can see, coming out of the heart, we have the ascending aorta, which is ascending or coming out of the top of the heart. The ascending aorta is then going to curve over and form the arch of the aorta. And then the arch of the aorta will then continue down the thoracic cavity as the descending aorta, or the thoracic aorta. So what is important is that the major vessels of the upper limb are actually going to stem from the arch of the aorta. So you can see on the arch we have three what we call collateral branches branching off. So from right we have the brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk is going to supply blood to the right part of the upper limb. In the middle, we have the left common carotid artery, which is going to go up to supply the left part of the neck and the head. And then our third collateral branch is going to be the left subclavian artery. And this is going to supply the left arm and left forearm. So if we start with the brachiocephalic trunk, you can notice that we have the small little bit, which is going to be a trunk, before it splits into what we call terminal branches. We also say that it's going to bifurcate into these branches. So the first one, arching over to the right, is going to be the right subclavian artery. And then the one going straight up to the head and neck is going to be the right common carotid artery. So you'll notice that we actually have a mirror image on both sides. Our common carotid artery, so whenever you hear the term common, it generally means that a vessel is going to split into an internal and an external artery. So you can see up here, our right common carotid artery will split into the right external carotid artery. And then it's also going to split into the right internal carotid artery. So remembering that the external carotid artery is going to supply the face as well as the superficial muscles of the scalp, and the internal carotid arteries are then going to supply the brain and the internal structures of the head. And we have the same on the left side. If we then continue with the blood supply to the arm, you will notice that we have subclavian arteries on both sides. Subclavian meaning that it's going to be passing underneath the clavicle, until we get to this landmark over here, which is going to be the lateral border of the first rib. So it is important that when we're describing the origins and the terminations of each blood vessel, that we do identify the major skeletal or soft tissue landmarks that the transitions will occur. So we say that the left subclavian artery is going to continue, or it's a continuation, as the axillar artery at the lateral aspect of the first rib. So over here we have the axillary artery. And the axillary artery is then going to continue as the brachial artery. So the transition that the axillary is going to transition to the brachial is going to occur at the inferior border of the teres major muscle. So before we go any further, I just want to pay some particular attention to the axillary artery. The axillary artery is actually divided up into three parts, and this is fairly important. So just drawing on our picture here, I'm going to draw a specific muscle, and this is going to be the pectoralis minor muscle. So let's just draw this in up here. So the reason the pectoralis minor muscle is important is it's going to help us delineate the three parts of the axillary artery. So everything superior or proximal to the pectoralis minor is going to be the first part, or the proximal part of the axillary artery. Part of the artery that passes underneath of pec minor is going to be the second part, and then the third part is going to be distal to the pec minor. Why this is important is for each segment of the axillary artery, we actually have collateral branches coming off of this that you need to know, which are going to supply aspects of the thorax, the scapula, as well as the humerus. So firstly, I'm just going to draw them up in this direction. So the first part, or the first collateral branch of the axillary artery, is the superior thoracic artery. The second part of the axillary artery has two collateral branches. So the first one is going to be the Thoracic-acromial artery. And then the second collateral branch is going to be the lateral thoracic artery. And then lastly, and I know things are starting to look a little bit messy, but the third segment of the axillary artery actually has three collateral branches. So firstly, we have two collateral branches that are actually wrapping around the head of the humerus, and we call these our circumflex. So we have an anterior and a posterior circumflex artery, and these wrap around the head of the humerus. And then our third collateral branch is actually supplying the scapula. So this runs with the subscapularis muscle, and it's called, you guessed it, the subscapularis artery. So unfortunately, I do expect you to know those 6 collateral branches of the axillary artery. So if we continue with the blood supply running down the arm, we have the brachial artery, which is obviously running in the brachial region, but this is an anterior muscle, which means that we have a collateral branch, which is going to be our profundus brachii, or the deep brachial artery. So this is actually going to be supplying the posterior aspects of the arm. When we reach the point of the cubital fossa, so particularly the head of the radius, the brachial artery is going to bifurcate into the ulnar and the radial artery. So the ulnar artery is always going to be on the medial aspect, and the radial artery is always going to be on the lateral aspect. So I will be making a video of the intricate blood supply of the hand and the wrist, but I will, in this diagram, show you the distal collateral branches associated with the ulnar and the radius. So specifically, there are 3 major branches that we need to know associated with the ulnar and the radius. But what's important first is to remember that when we're talking about the hand and wrist, that there are 2 palmar arches. So we have a superficial and a deep palmar arch. So the deep palmar arch is actually going to be the termination of the radial artery. So I'll write this in here. And then the termination of the ulnar artery is going to be the superficial palmar arch. So I'm just going to write it as the abbreviation. So the distal collateral branches then, so if we start with the radius first, we have the palmar branch of the radial artery. We then have the dorsal branch of the radial artery. And then we also have what's called the superficial branch, or the superficial palmar branch of the radial artery. So the superficial palmar branch of the radial artery is actually going to anastomose with the superficial palmar arch, which is then stemming from the ulnar artery. So on the other side, it's fairly simple. It's pretty much mirroring the same thing. So firstly, we have the palmar branch of the ulnar artery. We have the dorsal branch of the ulnar artery. And then the same, because it's contributing to form the deep palmar arch in the hand, we have the deep palmar branch of the ulnar artery. So that's this one up here. So at this stage, I just want you to know these distal branches or collateral branches of the ulnar and the radius, but we will go into it in a bit more depth when we do the blood supply to the hand and the wrist. So that essentially is the blood supply of the arm and the forearm. So what I'm going to go through now is the blood supply to the head and neck, and more specifically the blood supply of the brain. So we're continuing with this region up here, specifically the internal carotid arteries. So something that I forgot to mention when we were going through all these collateral branches is there's actually a collateral branch associated with the subclavian on each side, which is called the vertebral artery. So we have the left vertebral, and the vertebral arteries are actually going through the intervertebral foramina in the cervical vertebrae, entering through the foramen magnum, and then are going to contribute towards the blood supply of the posterior parts of the brain.